I have a terrible confession to make. Putting the presentation together, I thought I would have all the answers, and in fact I don't. So my presentation is all about opportunities and areas where we might do more work and think hard about how to progress. But I'm afraid I don't have, here's the 10-point plan to make the world a better place. What I am going to do is explain just a couple of very basic things on what is pharmacovigilance, and for some of you it'll be almost insulting, but for some of you perhaps that have got a more clinical background, the regulatory pharmacovigilance might be a little bit alien. And then I want to just present to you the headlines of the new pharmacovigilance legislation, because I believe there are an enormous amount of opportunities within it for public health in general, but for pharmacogenomics more specifically. So I've preempted that slide slightly. I'm going to outline fundamentally the new legislation for you. So before I go into new legislation, and this is particularly for those of you not in industry or regulatory authorities, the classic process list of pharmacovigilance says that pharmacovigilance is the science and processes of detecting and taking action on adverse reactions to medicines. And it talks about collecting and managing data, detecting and managing signals, evaluating safety issues, benefit risk assessment for the most important safety issues, taking regulatory action to minimize risk, communicating those actions, and then audit to make sure that we've been effective. Now, about 10 years ago, the new kid on the block was called risk management planning. And actually risk management planning isn't particularly novel. It's just, let's try and be a bit more proactive with our safety monitoring. Because if you actually look at a definition of risk management planning, to me, it's almost the same as a definition of pharmacovigilance. But the key point is planning. It's about being proactive in our collection of data and in our management of major safety issues. Now, so that's actually been the system in many member states and at a European level for decades and decades. And in terms of who is directly regulated by the system, it's the industry and medicines regulators. There are no direct legal obligations placed on healthcare professionals and patients at a European level. And back in 2003, some eminent colleagues in pharmacovigilance and in the regulatory world published what was then regarded as the excellence in pharmacovigilance model to say, okay, process is one thing, but we need more to make the world a better place. We need best evidence, so let's go out and get really high quality evidence to support the surveillance of medicines. Let's have robust scientific decision making. Let's ensure we have adequate tools to protect public health. And if those equate somewhat to the process steps in the previous slide, we need to put those process steps into a culture of scientific development. In other words, we need to have training, we need to be improving the methods of analyzing safety issues and so on. And we also need to be sure that we're being effective. In other words, we need to have outcome measures and audit. And I think it's fair to say that particularly audit and demonstrating that we have been effective at minimizing risk has been an area where regulators have not been very good in the past. We tend to take action and just keep our fingers crossed that it's been effective in protecting public health. And that's why the bit at the bottom of this slide, measurable excellence in terms of public health protection and public health benefit, is really important. So if that's by way of background, one other concept which I believe underpins the new legislation is what used to be referred to as the evidence hierarchy, but what people now refer to as just different types of evidence. And the reason that people have often dropped the term hierarchy is that sometimes it'll be a clinical anecdote, by which I mean a report of a suspected adverse reaction, which is the best way to get evidence in a particular scenario. It doesn't necessarily follow that because you're what used to be the top of the evidence hierarchy, with, for example, a meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials, that you've necessarily got the best evidence. So I think it is reasonable now to talk about embracing the entire spectrum of evidence to ensure that we effectively monitor the benefits and risks of medicines in the post-authorization phase. So let's talk about the new legislation, and what I will do is set out what it tries to achieve and then go through some of the key measures, highlighting where there may be opportunities for public health and then more specifically for pharmacogenomics. Now, some of you will have seen this slide before, but it was the slide that justified the proposal from the European Commission to take make proposals for major change to the regulatory framework. And these data are taken from the published literature and then combined with routine health statistics from Europe, like number of hospital admissions, et cetera, to give European numbers and percentages. But it's quite sobering. 5% of all hospital admissions are for adverse drug reactions. 5% of hospital patients suffer an adverse drug reaction. Adverse drug reactions are the 5th most common cause of hospital death. And it's estimated that there are nearly 200,000 deaths per year in the EU from adverse reactions. And finally, the cost to society was estimated to be nearly 80 billion a year from adverse drug reactions. So that is the motivation to strive to do better. Now, the process of changing the legislation took many years, and part of that was to demonstrate what the strengths and weaknesses of the current system are. And I won't go through this slide, but I think it's fair to say that about 6, 7 years ago, an independent study showed that while we had one of the most robust systems in the world for post-authorization management of medicines, when I say we, Europe, there were clearly opportunities to do even better. And this slide lists those opportunities. The reason I'm not going to go through them point by point is that the objectives, which come in the next slide, actually mirror the weaknesses very closely. So this just gives you, just so that if you take in your home pack, you'll probably have a zip file with your slides, I guess, or they'll be emailed, just that you've got the legal references is the only reason that I show you this slide. But basically, this new legislation came into effect in July of this year. So we're really in the eye of the storm in terms of implementing this huge new raft of legal measures. So I said that I would talk about the objectives, which mirror the weaknesses of the current system. So if we just go to the highest level, the headline is to promote and protect public health by reducing the burden of adverse drug reactions and optimizing the safe and effective use of medicines. So no change there, really. But I think the key word that isn't in that is to better protect or better promote than we have in the past. If you go down to operational objectives, it's about having clear roles and responsibilities and robust and rapid EU decision-making on safety issues. Just to give you a little bit of background, in the old European system, often it was unclear who was meant to be doing a particular task within the European system. I'll give you a very real example. We have 40,000 adverse drug reaction reports coming in electronically to this agency every month, and the old legislation did not say anything on who should actually look at those reports. So some people thought it was somebody else's problem, and other people thought it was everything was their problem, but you can see the problem. So the legislation clearly defines that it's such and such a person's responsibility. That's just one example where EU legislation was not crystal clear on who did what. Robust and rapid EU decision-making, I would say this had been and has been particularly a challenge for older nationally authorized products, and particularly for substances that are active substances that are in multiple, sometimes thousands of different products. You've got 30 EEA member states, all doing action or assessment potentially in parallel or not at all. And the coordination of that, and then assessing that and it leading to regulatory action at a European level, has often been patchy. And that was because of the informal nature of the Pharmacovigilance Working Party and the fact that its outputs were not legally binding. The next operational objective is to engage patients and healthcare professionals, and I hope I'll demonstrate a few of the examples where that it comes to reality. To make pharmacovigilance more science-based, so to stop thinking about it only in process terms, to stop thinking about it just as reporting suspected adverse drug reactions, and to really embrace that evidence hierarchy that I talked about before, and where appropriate to integrate benefit and risk. In terms of risk proportionality, the old legislation often placed the same obligations on the 1,000th generic as it did on the first in a class of a new biological. At least in principle it did. And the legislation tries to make the efforts of industry and the efforts of the regulators, and for that matter, the efforts of the healthcare community and patient community in terms of participating in trials or observational studies, etc., much more proportionate to the risk profile of the product. Increased proactivity and planning with risk management plans, reduced duplication and redundancy, particularly clarifying who does a particular assessment at European level so that we don't end up with 4 member states doing the same assessment at more or less the same time. And finally, and really importantly, dramatic increase in transparency and better information on medicines is the last operational objective. So, fully respecting the chair's aim to stay on time, I'm going to just whiz through the different areas and just highlight a few opportunities which I think then may feed the discussion part of this afternoon's session. And as I said, I don't have all the answers, but I'm just going to point out a few opportunities that will come from the new legislation. This one slide, if you wanted your credit card-sized aid memoir of the scope of the new legislation, it's this slide. But I won't go through the slide in detail because I elaborate a little bit in subsequent slides. But this is the scope of change. And actually, the take-home message is that this is a very, very broad and very deep change to the regulatory framework. In fact, it's the biggest change to the regulatory framework for human medicines, not just in drug safety, but anything to do with human medicines in probably 20 years. So let's just understand what these changes are and what the opportunities might be. So firstly, there is really very important strengthening of the European level coordination of pharmacovigilance. And that coordination is centred here at the European Medicines Agency. And we at the agency have a number of new responsibilities and tasks to perform on behalf of the European network. Very interestingly, and I think it will be of interest to the research community particularly, is that the legislation places an obligation for the industry to submit information on their medicinal products to the European Medicines Agency, not just for centrally authorised products, which have been the main focus of this agency's work in the past, not exclusively, but the main focus, but also for all the tens, if not hundreds of thousands of nationally authorised products on the European market. And what this is to do is that it then allows the European Medicines Agency to create, if you like, dictionaries of products and substances and routes of administration and dosage forms, so that and it also provides a process for keeping that up to date, so that we, for the first time at a European level, know what's on the European market. It really, really will change dramatically when it's fully implemented, the way that we regulate and coordinate safety monitoring and benefit risk monitoring in Europe. So let me just give you a few examples of what this might mean. So if we receive an adverse drug reaction report where a brand name has been written as being the suspect drug in the adverse reaction report, sometimes, particularly if it comes from outside Europe, we don't know what that brand name contains. We don't actually know what the drug substance is that the patient's exposed to. And you can see that that might be a bit of a kind of schoolboy error in terms of trying to monitor the safety of medicines. When we do have safety issues, let's say we've gone through a big, elaborate benefit risk assessment on, let's say, paracetamol, nice example. Today, we would have to send a letter to each of the member states saying, dear member state, tell me what products you've got on your territory containing paracetamol. And to be frank, not all the member states would reply to the letter. So when we come to take the regulatory action at the end, it's going to be partial, even for legally binding procedures. Whereas this database, when fully populated, validated, and fully operational, will mean that we will have an official source of information on all the medicinal products on the European market, so we can make sure that the right warnings get into the right product information rapidly following assessment. And the last one, I think, was to whet the appetites of the research community. And it's not going to be tomorrow, and it's not going to be the day after tomorrow, but I would hope that within a year, 18 months, 2 years, we will have products that you can use. When I say products, terminologies and dictionaries that you can use for your research purposes, because at the moment we have very poor information on what's on the European market in terms of substances and products. So opportunity to the research community. For the sake of time, the ones that are less exciting for pharmacogenomics I'll miss out. This one is probably the key opportunity of all, risk management plans and post-authorization studies. I can give a presentation of half an hour just on risk management plans, and if you want, you can have an hour on post-authorization safety studies, but I've decided to give you one slide just to whet your appetite so that maybe in the future we can come back and have a more in-depth discussion. But what does the new legislation do? It says that all new medicines on the European market will have a risk management plan. It's part of the authorization dossier requirement, so that what the company has to submit. The legislation places very clear legal hooks so that if justified by safety concerns or missing information, the regulators can place an obligation on the industry to conduct a post-authorization safety study or a post-authorization efficacy study. I've got a feeling we'll end up discussing this in the discussion phase, so I won't go into too much detail now. But bottom line, whereas in the past sometimes there was a kind of soft agreement between industry and regulators that a study needed to be done and the company would make a commitment to do it, it was not always legally enforceable, not always legally enforceable. With the new legislation, it will be. And if a company doesn't comply, at least potentially, the European Medicines Agency can take financial penalties in collaboration with the Commission against the company concerned. So, you know, serious stuff. In addition, there are new measures about oversight of studies. So this is about ensuring that the right study is done to address the question, the benefit-risk question on the medicine. It's also about plugging a gap, particularly in Europe. We've had a gap in terms of oversight of non-interventional studies, particularly epidemiological studies, where it wasn't clear who was responsible for actually overseeing that. And the new legislation places an obligation on this agency for studies that are going to be conducted except at the initiative of one individual member state. So what does this mean? And we can elaborate on this in the discussion. It means that patients and healthcare professionals may be asked to participate in studies on authorized medicines. And I think the key point there is more studies, probably, particularly safety studies. It means that we should have high quality information on the benefits and risks of medicines generated post-authorization, better information to support monitoring and decision making. And I think although it's not explicit in the legislation, it's implicit in the legislation that when appropriate, these studies, both safety and efficacy, could cover pharmacogenomic endpoints or could collect pharmacogenomic data. Obviously, if we're placing a legal obligation on a company to do research that will cost money, it always has to be justified by a concern and well motivated. But if it is, and there is a justifiable reason to do the study, then there's the legal basis to require that from the industry. I find this slide quite exciting, and it's probably because of a particular passion for epidemiology. But the new legislation contains specific legal responsibilities to measure / ensure the effectiveness of risk minimization. If you go back to that excellence in pharmacovigilance model slide that I showed you 5 minutes ago, I intonated that regulators have not always been very good at demonstrating that they've got the job done. In other words, we often take a piece of action, put a new warning in product information. We ask the company to send a letter to all doctors and pharmacists in Europe, or relevant doctors and pharmacists, and then we sleep soundly at night. But as has been often demonstrated in the medical literature, just putting something in product information or just sending a one-off a piece of information to healthcare professionals doesn't necessarily change behavior, neither in the short term and particularly not in a sustainable way. And that's what monitoring the effectiveness of risk minimization is all about. So for the most important safety issues, what does this mean? It means that we will, for the most important issues, measure whether safety messages have been understood, whether there's been a change in prescribing or dispensing behavior, and ultimately, for the very, very most significant drug safety issues, we will do health outcome studies or get the companies to do health outcome studies to make sure that we have reduced the burden of adverse drug reactions. So I think really that if we can do this, and it's going to be very challenging methodologically and in resource terms, but if we can do it, it really is the holy grail of what we're trying to achieve. In 2 minutes, okay. In terms of reporting suspected adverse reactions, this will come up in discussion, but the headline is that the legislation gives each citizen in Europe the right to report their suspected adverse drug reactions to the authorities and to the companies if they wish. And that completely changes the scope of the data that will be collected on suspected side effects in the future, and potentially increases the opportunities to detect drug safety issues earlier, and potentially also allows to go back to patients and potentially ask for volunteers in terms of collecting data. We've never thought through the practicalities of that, but I know there's a lot of interest in getting genomic data. And if you've got the data directly from the patient, you know who to go to. Signal detection, detecting new or changing safety issues. This is where I highlighted that in the past it wasn't always clear who did what. Well, in the new legislation, it's very clear who does what. And what this means is that we will be detecting safety issues faster and leading to changes in product information, new warnings, new risk minimization measures quicker, including, where appropriate, warnings or advice to test for pharmacogenomic biomarkers, for example. So in the last 60 seconds, I will repeatedly click this button. Can you help me at the back? Thank you. And the next one? Okay, just to highlight, there's a new committee. There's a new kid on the block in terms of EMA committees. It's called the Pharmacovigilance Risk Assessment Committee. It has expertise which includes pharmacogenomics, and I'm very pleased that Ying is able to join us for this meeting today as one of the key members of that committee with particular expertise in pharmacogenomics. And the point is that this committee will bring real expertise to the post-authorization assessment of risk and benefit risk issues. And there are processes in the legislation that mean that the outcome of that committee will be legally binding after various process steps. So no more do we have informal consensus sort of positions coming out of a working party that don't get converted into warnings. Now legally binding, the companies have to implement. And in the next one, and okay, this is probably important for you. There is a radical change in transparency. So decisions made in smoke-filled rooms with closed doors will become a thing of the past. The first agendas, the first minutes have already been published from this committee, but there's a radical step change in transparency associated with the new legislation. And the next slide, please. And the next slide. And the next slide. And the next slide. So just to say, I mentioned this already, we've already started publishing the agendas and the minutes in full. Next slide. And the next slide. So, in terms of the impact of this legislation, this is the biggest change to the legal framework for human medicine since at least 1995. The entire product life cycle, certainly peri and post-authorization, the entire life cycle is impacted. In effect, it's a major change project that will take a few years to fully implement, and we think that it may be 2016, 2017 before we see all of the benefits coming through. The PRAC has now operational and has had its first 3 meetings, and that's clearly a really important milestone, the PRAC being the Pharmacovigilance and Risk Assessment Committee. And we believe there's really important opportunities here for public health in general, but also for the collection and analysis of pharmacogenomic data in order to get good monitoring, good warnings, good risk minimization through into healthcare delivery. So thanks very much indeed.